Hello, and welcome to episode 7 of the One of the Many video cast with Rob Guzman. How are you today? I'm doing well. So, we've got a really busy program for you today. I'm going to try my best to keep it around 30 minutes, so I really had to be selective this week in the stories I selected. As I always do, just as a reminder, what I do in this show is I take the headlines from the week, throughout the last week in the news, and I look for the underlying elements that link them together, and I discuss them from this principled perspective so that you can get a feel for what are the prominent ideas in the news, what should you be paying attention to, or shouldn't you be paying attention to, what is essential, in other words. So before I do, I have two quick announcements. One, as a personal thing, I just want to say rest in peace, Paul Allen, Microsoft co-founder who died last week on Monday at the age of 65 due to failures of cancer. As a programmer, as a user of Windows as an operating system, and as a huge fan of Microsoft and just the tech industry in general, you can't put enough emphasis on a hero like Paul Allen, somebody who was there with Bill Gates and helped develop the Windows operating system in its early days, and later invested his many billions back in the tech industry in other companies. So I think we should all take a moment of silence today, or whenever we have a chance within the next week or so. I guess he's already died last week, so you should think about it and wish his family well. Hopefully his memory lives on. The second thing I want to say is that I did have my debate last week on the Me Too movement. So this was done with meetup.com at their meetup headquarters. There was actually 3 different debates. It was Me Too, it was tax cuts, and it was healthcare. And my good buddy Lewis did the debate on healthcare. I did the debate on Me Too, and other people did the debate on tax cuts. And they were very short, 20 minutes. They filmed it. It was one-on-one, meant to be a conversational style debate, not really a formal debate where you're at a podium, but 2 people seated in chairs, no moderator, just kind of a voice introducing the topic overhead, and then us kind of talking about it. I got in everything I really wanted to say. I will say, I haven't seen the full edited tape. I have in my mind what happened and what I would do differently if I were to do it all again. But one thing I kind of regret, and this isn't really my fault, but the person who I was debating against was actually her first debate ever. She was pretty nervous, and I think when you get nervous, it can kind of hamper the conversation. So I didn't feel like it was a really legit conversation. It was me and her kind of just talking past each other a little bit. I tried very hard to engage her ideas, but the meetup people just wouldn't have it. They kind of wanted us to stay on the Me Too topic, even though we both kind of brought up more philosophic points. So once that video is edited and is out on YouTube, I will post it on my blog, and you'll see it if you subscribe to this channel. I'll upload it as well to my YouTube channel when I get a chance and I get the full edited tape. But you can kind of assess how I did and how my arguments do in that debate. But I will say I'm going to use that announcement about that debate as kind of a springboard to discuss the first topic I want to discuss today. So, and that is the topic of not really just feminism, but I guess it's kind of feminism with another topic of egalitarianism. So I'm going to define my terms a little bit and establish what it is I'm talking about. And then I want to give you some concrete examples about what happened this last week that make this topic really important for this last week's events and just in our culture generally. So in my debate, the girl I debated with supported the Me Too movement, and I was against it. And my argument was essentially an individualist argument. I argued that women are not a monolith, that you have to look at the individual cases of these rapes and sexual assaults, that someone hearing a dirty joke or even getting catcalled isn't the same thing as being raped or sexually assaulted, and so you can't really bridge those together into one category. You have to distinguish them, and you have to look at the details of each case. You can't just put them all together into one big mass and say, now you have a movement, let's go get them. I think that's just not right. I think it's unjust because it throws out the facts of the individual case for the purposes of a narrative. And I think that I made that point very clear. Now, my opponent's view was that of what I would say is the typical postmodern feminist, which is that our society basically is ruled by a patriarchy. Patriarchy means a male-dominated government or a male-dominated cultural structure that basically puts blinders, inhibitors on women, that it keeps them down and it elevates men. It elevates masculinity, it elevates male power at the expense of women and female power. So this is the view of a lot of people today who describe themselves as feminists, radical feminists, third-wave feminists, whatever you want to call yourself. The general feminist movement has taken this line as essentially gospel. And this comes out of postmodern political and ethical and epistemological philosophy. The idea that your senses are unique to you as an identity group. So me as a man, I perceive reality different from a woman. And a black man may perceive reality different from a white man. A gay man may perceive reality different from a straight woman, and so on and so forth. So your identity group determines how you perceive reality, and so as a result, you have this balkanization of perspectives, and really there's no objective truth at the end of the day, because everything is basically just subjective. It's all based on the tribe you belong to, and so on and so forth. So there's no objective truth. Objective truth is out, and it's all about power. It's about which group has power, which one can enforce their view of the world on everybody else. So I don't believe this has got any basis in fact. I think this is hokum, nonsense. It's mysticism. And I think no evidence is ever really proffered for this. I would have pressed her to offer evidence, and I really didn't get a chance in that debate. If I were to have debate 2.0, I would have asked her and pressed her to give some evidence of the supposed patriarchy in America. Because here in America, we have a constitution, we have individual rights, and while it's true that women didn't have the right to vote until the early part of the 20th century, we're long past that now. It's been over 100 years. And, our laws, the essence of our Constitution is one of individual rights. And, there were inconsistencies applying that with slavery and Jim Crow as well when it came to black Americans. But the fact is, the philosophy of this country is an individualistic one. It's essentially Aristotelian in its foundations. It's not this kind of group power struggle thing. It's not a feudal society, right? It's not based on feudalism. It's not a fascist totalitarian society. It's not a communist or socialist society. It's a limited government where everyone has individual rights. It's a republic. It's not a democracy either, for those of you who like to use that word. So she really defended this view, and I opposed it. And that was kind of our sticking point, where we disagreed. Now, this idea of postmodernism and the tribal nature of your senses and the fact that there is no objective truth, that's one strand of the feminist philosophy. Another strand is Marxism, good old-fashioned evil Marxism. This idea that not only are there identity groups that have their own peculiar way of seeing reality, but these particular identity groups are in a struggle, a cosmic struggle, a dialectic struggle. If you don't know that word, what a dialectic is basically, actually it was originally the philosopher Hegel's idea. Marx took it over from Hegel. And the idea behind a dialectic is you have some force called a synthesis that basically prevails. And this was Hegel's view with regard to ideas or culture, right? He believed that you had a synthesis, which was the dominant culture, the dominant ideas of the time. They would be opposed by their opposite, an antithesis. That's where the word antithesis, which is opposite, comes from. The two would struggle, and eventually they would merge together. It'd be a merging of opposites, and that would be what was called a synthesis, coming together. And that synthesis would then form the basis of the new thesis. And this kind of three-step waltz of synthesis, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This kind of defines history, according to Hegel. And it's a deterministic thing. There's no free will. There's no real agency. There's no individuals. It's all based on these kind of this cosmic battle of ideas, right? Now, Marx took that and applied it to social and economic, particularly economic classes. So you had the workers versus the capitalists. And those two would be two examples of classes that would fight. They would basically merge, and they would fuse into a new class. Would be a new type of man that would come out of it, a new type of individual who wouldn't be selfish, would only want to work for as much as he needed, and he would always work to the greatest extent of his ability, and so on. So feminism takes that over and applies it to male-female relationships. So you've got thesis, antithesis in the form of men, women. Men exploiting women, women fighting back, and they're supposed to kind of merge together, and, at that point, you get kind of really mystical, and you're not even sure what's going on. Maybe a post-gender society is the next idea, which you're kind of seeing today. But that's another strand of the feminist sort of trichotomy. You've got postmodernism, you've got Marxism, and the third is what I want to talk about today with some of the headlines from last week. And I'm sorry it took me so long to get here, but this is important stuff. And that's egalitarianism. Now, egalitarianism is a huge word. Maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't. Some people think it's a good thing. A lot of people think it's a good thing. And they think it just means, wanting to treat people equally before the law. That is not egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is wider than that. Basically, egalitarianism is the view that justice, what is right, what is morally right, is based on equality, the fact of equality. And where there is an inequality that occurs, there is ipso facto, prima facie, some kind of injustice that has occurred. So, a system or a society or any kind of framework you can think of is just to the extent that things are equal. Okay? To the extent they are not equal, they are unjust. And that is grounds for complaining and wanting to tear it down and rebuild it. So for a feminist who's taken in by both Marxism and postmodernism, the egalitarianist element says, well, we can't actually acknowledge the morality or immorality or the any characteristics that are different. We can't acknowledge them as being better or worse. So let me give you a really concrete example of this. Actually, this is my example. This is my good buddy Chuck's example, but it's a great example. Suppose you're an employer and you're hiring somebody for a job. Okay? And let's say you're hiring an office worker, and let's say you're hiring someone who's going to be like a business manager or a project manager. They have to be on staff for a few months, learn the business, and they have to follow through with a project over an extended period of time. Now, when you're going to recruit people, you obviously want to recruit people for a variety of criteria, right? How well do they know the business? How good are they at managing their time? How intelligent are they? How well they can answer your questions about the job? So on and so forth, right? Those are all valid criteria. But there are other criteria, and those, I would say, those criteria don't differ significantly between men and women. But another type of criteria might be, well, if it's a younger woman and you have a long-range project and that person has to be involved in it, then whether that woman is likely to get pregnant and have a baby within the next 5 years may be a really important factor. Maybe it's really hard for you as a firm to hire somebody who's going to be out for a significant amount of time within the next, say, 5 years. And if you've got a woman who's maybe in her mid-20s or early 30s and she wants to have a baby in that time, you objectively, as a firm, don't want to hire that person. She is actually less likely to be a good candidate for that reason compared to a man who's not going to have that same problem. Now, there may be other reasons why the man may not be a good hire. Maybe he's irresponsible, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, that's a criteria, and that's a difference that exists between men and women. Now, what egalitarians say is that we don't deny the difference necessarily. We can say men don't have babies and women do. We can say that. That's permissible under an egalitarian system. What we can't ever do, what we can never do, is acknowledge that one person in that arrangement or one trait in that factual arrangement is better than the other. We can't say that because you're a woman and you might give birth, that makes you a less valuable employee for the job than a man who doesn't have that. See what I'm saying? Another example. Same thing with men and women. Let's say you're talking about a fireman. You're trying to hire someone to be a firefighter. Well, to be a firefighter, you've got to be tall and strong. You've got to be able to lift heavy weights up ladders and down ladders. So let's say you decide, I have a choice between a man and a woman, and the man is, say, 6'4", 220 pounds, and he's got a lot of upper body strength, a lot of muscle. He can bench press, 300 pounds, whatever it is. He's like a, Arnold Schwarzenegger type. That might be a really good candidate for a firefighter, particularly if they're going up the ladder and bringing people out of burning buildings. But if you've got, a 4'10" woman who's, who weighs less than 100 pounds, maybe not 100 pounds, that's really unhealthy. Maybe let's say 100, maybe she weighs 100 pounds, 110 pounds, and she can barely lift half her body weight. She's got no upper body strength. That isn't a good candidate for a firefighter. Now, what an egalitarian would say is, well, you can point out the differences between the muscles of these two people. And you can point out that the fact that this guy is bigger and heavier and has more weight to his arms, he can lift more than her. That's all valid to say, but you can't say one is better than the other. You can't ever say that one is better than the other. And that's because inequality is viewed as unjust and immoral. And so to the extent that they exist, and we acknowledge that they exist, that's us being bigoted, us being discriminatory, and that's where you get a lot of these kind of schemes to try to make things that are unequal, equal. So let's give you some headline examples. So I'll give you 2 examples from this last week. One is there was a transgender cyclist who was competing against women in the World Championships in Los Angeles, who won the event, a transgender woman, meaning that biologically, she or it or however whatever pronoun you want to use for it, it basically was a biological man that underwent a operation to become a woman. So she had more testosterone in her system. She had a bigger muscle stature. She was biologically a man, and then was transitioned, had her genitalia removed and whatever, to become a woman. All right. Now, she won the event, and there were women who she competed against who complained and called foul. So this isn't fair. This is a man competing against a woman. And, one of the article quotes, this is from the cyclist who won, said, quote, "This is bigger than sports, and it's about human rights. By catering to cisgender people's views, that furthers transgender people's oppression. When it comes to extending rights to a minority population, why would we ask the majority? I bet a lot of white people were pissed off when we desegregated sports racially and allowed black people, but they had to deal with it," unquote. So again, you can see here that there's a couple things in this quote that are very revealing. For one thing, what is a man or a woman isn't something that's based on biology and objective facts and reality. It's on how you feel. It's whether or not you feel like you're a man or you feel like you're a woman. That's enough grounds for you to become one in the views of this person and in the views of most people on the left who support this kind of radical constructionist way of looking at it, this sort of postmodern identity politics, incorporation of the transgender movement. So it's bigger than sports, and it's about human rights, because everyone has a human right to identify however they want, and that overrides objective facts. So that's very revealing, very dangerous, I think. The second thing is they're comparing it, or this person's comparing it, to segregation and desegregating sports. Well, there's a difference here. As far as I can see, there's really no difference in race when it comes to things like sports. We have great athletes who are Asian. There are great athletes who are American, like whites. There are great athletes that are Central, Northern Europeans, the big weightlifter guys, like the Arnold Schwarzenegger types, the Austrians, the Polish, the Hungarians. We've got Hispanics, we've got Africans. People all over the world have demonstrated great athletic prowess. As far as I can see, there's nothing essential about being black or being white that makes you more athletic than the other. Even though it is true that most of the fastest runners on the planet are Africans, are like Ugandans, at the end of the day, there's no evidence that I could see for it being genetic or it being racially based. So in the case of desegregating sports, it wasn't like you were taking two different things and artificially separating them. What you were doing is you were taking one thing that was exactly the same, men who were black who were playing baseball and men who were white who were playing baseball, and putting them in different leagues. And that was arbitrary and based on a non-essential criterion, which is their race. Now, with women and sports, it's very clear that men tend to be bigger than women. They're larger, they tend to be more muscular, they have more testosterone in their system. These things allow them to go for further distances in running and cycling and swimming. That's why they have a men's league soccer and a women's league soccer. That's why they segregate sports along gender lines. It's not anything to do with the fact that, women are not any less dedicated to the sport than men, that they can't achieve excellence, but your standard of excellence differs because of biological considerations. Just like women tend to be built in a way to sort of facilitate having children. They tend to have wider hips. They tend to have bigger breasts. Men don't have as big breasts. They don't have as wide hips. So that's not a knock against men or a knock against women. They're different. There's an inequality there, and that's a totally valid and moral inequality. It's based on reality. To say that it's immoral or wrong to acknowledge that is an egalitarian premise that I think is toxic and wrong, because it ultimately evades and ignores the facts of reality. Along the same lines, this is a more humorous story or a humorous variation of this, But Kleenex had to rebrand their tissues this week. Basically, they had these brand of tissues called Kleenex man-sized tissues, which are bigger and softer than your average Kleenex tissue, I guess. And, they came under attack. And what was the attack? Well, how can you say that men are bigger or tend to be bigger and stronger and more durable, last longer than a woman? The implication of a man-sized tissue is that this tissue is sturdier. It can carry more phlegm, which is gross, but yeah, it can carry more phlegm, and it's harder to tear it. It can maybe withstand more weight. It's bigger, so it covers more surface area on your face, etc. That's what they're calling a man-sized tissue. And the implication is that women-sized tissues would be smaller, maybe a little daintier, maybe not as rugged or as difficult to break. Now, again, I think it's an objective fact, biological objective fact, that on the whole, men tend to be stronger than women. Doesn't mean that you can't have some freakishly powerful, Russian woman who's on steroids who can bench press a Chevy, and you've got someone like me who's, a programmer. I've got this soft, shitty body, I'm not that athletically inclined. I'm not a slouch, but I'm not Schwarzenegger material. I'm not, a bodybuilder. So, you can have individuals who break the mold, and you can be an exception to that. But on the whole, the generalization follows from the biology of the people involved. The fact that the vast majority of men are a certain way, and the vast majority of women are a certain way, and that's how they compare with one another. So again, egalitarianism, one of the strands of feminism today, it's not just in feminism. You see it in multiculturalism, where they try to compare different cultures and say that you can acknowledge factual differences between cultures, but you can't say one culture is better than another. It's egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is basically the bedrock principle of leftist politics in America today. It is basically the founding philosophy of today's postmodern left, and it's everywhere. It's going to be a very common theme on this show. I'm sure I'll be talking about it again in other contexts, so keep an eye open for it, and you'll see more. Now, that was a long first point. Now, the other story I want to talk about is more to do with race, and that's a couple stories that revolve around this. And to introduce the headlines here, what I want to do is I want to talk about a premise that I think is very important to fight, and it's a premise that is held, as far as I know, by everybody in contemporary American politics on both the left and the right. And that is the intermingling or the interleaving of culture and race. Now, let me explain. A lot of people on the postmodern left will say things like race is a social construct. They'll say race doesn't exist. Well, I have news for you. I don't think race is a social construct. I think race does exist if what we're talking about with regards to race is biological differences. If we're talking about me having a different set of ancestors from you, and I have a different appearance, different predisposition to certain genetic diseases, I have a more likelihood to have a hitchhiker's thumb or polydactyly or whatever it is, sickle cell anemia. There are lots of different genetic differences between people that are a result of their ancestry. Now, it's true, humans are all related ultimately if you go back far enough on the evolutionary tree, on the cladogram that forms the evolutionary history of life on Earth. We have a common ancestor, but that doesn't mean today we have the same proximate ancestors on the tree. There are different leaves, different offshoots, and so as a result, people have different traits. Some people are blonde, some people have brown hair. Some people are black skin, some people have white skin, some people have brown skin. All these things differ with your genes. And if we're talking about your physical appearance, your genotypes, your phenotype that emerges from your genotype, how your genes are structured, that is valid, that's objective, that's not socially constructed. The fact that a person's skin is different from someone else is an objective fact. It's not socially constructed, right? So that's the first point, is that race is real. It does exist if you're talking about genetic appearances, genetic lineage. Now, separating that, if you're talking about someone say their character or their ideas or how they conduct themselves, their manners, what they choose to do with their lives, whether they're moral, whether they're good people, these, as far as I can see, and as far as the evidence bears out, don't have a connection to your genes. In fact, they are distinct from your genes. Your genes can basically give you certain traits and maybe give you certain predispositions, but they certainly don't shape everything that you do and the way you behave to the T. You have free will. You have lots of things that affect your life whether it's role models in your life, decisions based on economic circumstances that you grow up in, or even just your values, the things that you choose to enjoy, whether you like reading a book or watching an opera, whether you like vanilla versus chocolate ice cream. There are lots of tastes and variations in people's makeup that aren't genetic. Okay. Now, one source of that, and not the only source, but one source is culture. And that's the area you grow up in. This is the whole nature versus nurture idea. Well, I got news for you. It's not just nature versus nurture. There's nature and there's nurture and there's your choices, your individual choices, your free will choices that are not affected by either of these two. So in fact, there are three things, not just two. It's a false alternative to say one or the other. But that's more besides the point. Your race is not your culture. Okay? Your culture is where you grow up, what you choose to take on and what you don't choose to take on. So if you grow up in, say, a fishing village that's practices Shintoism in Asia, in Japan maybe, you can grow up and choose to be a practicing Shintoist. You can practice fishing if that's the dominant trend in your village. Or you can say, you know what, I'm going to be an atheist. I'm not convinced by the religion of the ancestor worship, and I'd rather move to India, or I'd rather move to Europe or the United States and fulfill a career in software development. Now, obviously, you have to know that there are alternatives before you can leave and pursue those alternatives. But in principle, in today's world, this is open as an exception. Everyone is open to be an exception if they choose. They can choose to go along with their culture, and that's often the easy way to do it. Just because the majority of people who are born to Catholic parents become Catholics doesn't mean that you are predestined to be a Catholic because of your race. Catholicism, religion, what your political orientation is, whether you're a good or a bad person, isn't a result of your genes. It's a result of your choices, and these two get conflated a lot. Now, generally, I like to think that your genes are something you don't have control over, and so you can't really hold a person morally responsible for their genes. You can hold a person morally responsible for their decisions, their choices, and how they live, and who they are, what they make of their soul, as Aristotle might say. Their soul being their character, not some kind of mystical piece that lives in another dimension, but who you are as an individual and what you value and whether people like you or not and how you engage with other people. So the two stories that come out of this are twofold. So first of all, we had Elizabeth Warren, Democratic senator from Massachusetts, my home state actually, and former college professor at Harvard, who basically is probably going to run for president in 2020 against Trump or whoever else the Republicans field, if they don't field Trump. And she came out saying that she took a DNA test and she got evidence that she is at least partially Cherokee Indian. Now, I've read conflicting reports about what the test said exactly, but the majority of the stories that I've read and just based on the respectability of the publications that I've read the figures out of, it looks like she's anywhere from 1/64th to 1/1024th Cherokee. Now, to make that concrete, what that means is she may have had an ancestor. In the worst case, she's had an ancestor that goes back 10 generations before she becomes who was a Native American. And the way you do that is you take 1/2 to the power, and the 1/64 is a power of 2, or power of a half, and so is 1/1024, and that's how many generations back she had a Native American or an Indian in her family tree. And even that isn't certain because, as the people who were talking about the test explain, they're only giving us information about geographically, roughly where the ancestors may have originated. It doesn't tell you whether they were Cherokee or whether they were Aztec or whether they were even one of the other, Central American or South American tribes. So it's really unclear whether she really is at all Cherokee. And even if she was, and she had some ancestor 10 generations ago, and she's 1/1024th Cherokee, it hardly matters. I mean, the Cherokee Nation blasted her for this, saying that, you're basically kind of tarring our name by saying that DNA testing has anything to do with being a Cherokee. In fact, they have their own rules about how to determine whether someone's Cherokee or not. They had a descendant of Pocahontas, the real Pocahontas, not fake, not Pocahontas, like I call Elizabeth Warren, Pocahontas. A real descendant of Pocahontas actually came out and said something similar. Lots of Democrats, leftists coming out criticizing her harshly for this, saying she's very ignorant to do this. Conservatives, of course, ridiculing her. Trump ridiculing her. Trump, I guess, promised a $1 million payout, a bet, if she was at all Indian. And she's now saying, well, pay up. And, I heard Ben Shapiro, actually this made me crack up. Ben Shapiro said Trump should have given her 1/1024th of the $1 million, like $990, and said, okay, there you go, you get your money. That would have been, if he had thought to do that, that would have been, I think, very funny, and I think it would have been devastating. I think this is already devastating to her candidacy. I don't know who advised her to do this and why, but it was a terrible idea. Because, first of all, as I said earlier, being a Cherokee in today's world, being someone who affiliates with the Cherokee Nation, has Cherokee customs and has Cherokee friends and hangs out with other Cherokee and, indulges in the Cherokee culture, that's not a genetic thing, right? Culture is not genetic. I am partially Cuban. My dad was born in Cuba. So you could say that I may have some not so distant relationship with Fidel Castro. Through our family trees. Maybe if you go back 5 or 6 generations, we have some ancestor in common who originated from Cuba. But that doesn't mean that we share the same values. I'm not a communist at all, and he is. So, just because you have the same DNA or the same lineage as somebody doesn't mean you share their values and doesn't mean that you indulge in their cultures. Because culture is something that is an idea. It's something you have to accept voluntarily in order to hold it. So I think that this story of Elizabeth Warren coming out, it tells us, it's a great example of this, and it's actually kind of ironic that it hit her of all people, because I don't really like her, but I think this is very damaging to her campaign. If it does get off the ground, I'll be very surprised if she still does well and runs with this kind of baggage, because she could have just let it lie, and it would have just been Trump being Trump, making fun of her. She could have maybe attacked him for being a bully. Now she's basically given in to this, idea that race and culture are connected. So she's being attacked by every side. Everybody is attacking her for it. So it's not good optics at all for her. The other story that comes along with this is Harvard. Harvard basically, last Monday, Harvard is being sued by a group called the FSA, which is something like the Students for Fair Admissions. It took me a few seconds to remember that because I was looking through my notes, couldn't even find it. The SFA, Students for Fair Admissions, and they're basically a group of Asian students who are suing Harvard because Harvard is supposedly discriminating against Asians. And the way they're doing this is by something called a personal rating, which is part of the application for every student at Harvard. And it's this subjective measure that includes things like likability, courage, whether you're widely respected, whether you have a positive personality, all these things. And it's some scale. And it basically can give somebody an edge in the application process. So if you're Harvard and you're recruiting people, if you get a lot of Asian applicants that are very qualified, they have really good academics, they have great test scores, they have good grades, all that checks out, you can tinker with their application rating as it compares to everyone else, all the other students. And this group is alleging that this is exactly what Harvard's been doing, that they've essentially systematically been lowering the scores for Asians to give a boost to other groups so that they can have a diverse student body. Now, this is an interesting story to me for a couple of reasons. This is an interesting story because, put it this way, Harvard is a private institution. It's a private school. In my view, I don't think that there should be any law against private institutions discriminating on whatever grounds they want. I am profoundly against the Civil Rights Act if it means preventing people from trading with other people voluntarily or not. In other words, I don't think there should be laws against somebody being racist. You can't criminalize racism or discrimination on irrational grounds or bigotry. What you can do is say the government shouldn't do that, and that I'm totally for. The government is the institution concerned with physical force in society. They're the government. The government is the institution that has a monopoly on force. They have the power of the gun. Okay? So you can, and they are responsible for protecting the rights of all the citizens. So they cannot be bigoted. They cannot be discriminatory. And so you can have properly laws against government discrimination. But private discrimination is totally valid if it occurs in the context of people deciding to trade or not trade. So in this case, if Harvard wants to discriminate against Asians, they damn well should have the right to do it. Now, I don't support it. I think they would take a beating in the market if that were the case. They would lose some prestige if they came out doing that, maybe. And I also don't think the government should be paying bills for them and giving them aid, subsidizing their research, and giving them grants for their buildings. I think if they're private, they're private. Government should be out of education altogether. That's a different topic for a different day, and we'll get more into that. But so that part of me is kind of against this suit on those grounds, on the grounds that the school shouldn't be prevented from discriminating if it's a private school. Now, you could make a quibble about whether they receive federal money, and as long as they receive X federal dollars a year, they shouldn't be allowed to do it. You can make that argument, and I think I'm okay with that argument. But on the grounds that if they were getting any federal aid, suppose tomorrow they were to say, okay, no federal aid, we don't want it, then they should be allowed to discriminate. That's totally within their rights as property owners, and it's under their right of free association to do that. Now, where I sympathize with the plaintiffs, the FSA, the SFA, Students for Fair Admissions. Got to remember that. It's not that important, so I probably won't remember it that long. Where I'm sympathetic is along the point I made earlier, that diversity with regards to appearance, race, it's a sham. It's the stupidest thing you can imagine, because it assumes that there is a connection between your race and your ideas. It assumes implicitly that there is no difference between your culture and your DNA and your genetics. And that I reject, as I had mentioned earlier. I think that if you want to have a diversity of ideas, if you want to have leftists, conservatives, libertarians, objectivists, non-philosophical people of all stripes, you want to have people who believe in God and who don't believe in God, and who believe in 3 gods or 6 gods. If you want to have intellectual diversity at your school and have a really rigorous student body with a lot of debates and a lot of differences and disagreements, that's good. That's positive. But ideas are not tied to your genes. They're not tied to who you are in a DNA sense. So if I said, oh, it's great for us if we can recruit a diverse student body. We want to have not equal, but we want to have Asians, and we want to have blacks, and we want to have women, and we want to have Polynesians, and we want to have Europeans. And, that's just the wrong way to do it. It's basically trying to build a student body by non-essentials. It's basically trying to compute some weird, equilibrium point based on DNA. And it's really hard to do it. It's hard to even say this person's Asian or Polynesian versus this person is black, because how do you get into the mixed cases and all that? But even aside from that, you've already committed the heinous sin of equating ideas with race. And, that's racism. That's the definition of racism. That's basically saying that your ideas and your character come out of your race. So I think in this case, a pox on both their houses, a pox on Harvard for thinking that a diverse student body means having a diverse racial student body. That's horrible. And a pox on these, SFA people, the Students for Fair Admissions, who are trying to basically shoehorn in and prevent Harvard from running their school the way they want. Now, I have a little more sympathy for them and less of a smack for them, because in the context we're in, where the government is involved in education, I think they're right. I think affirmative action should be torn down and it should go the way of the dodo. But, we'll see if that happens. I don't think so. The ruling on this case will decide whether that happens or not. So we're already at almost 40 minutes. This is a long video. I covered some very philosophic topics here, some very complex things. So egalitarianism and how it relates to feminism, and discrimination and how it relates to race and culture, and how it relates to this whole Elizabeth Warren fiasco. There were some stories I didn't cover that I might cover next week. So I didn't cover any more on Khashoggi, the journalist who was murdered in Saudi Arabia. That story, I think everything I wanted to say about it, I more or less said last week, which is that, the Saudi government's it's an authoritarian theocracy. It's not a republic. It doesn't respect individual rights, and we shouldn't be their ally. So this whole scandal has kind of now enveloped the royal family, the Mohammed bin Salman, the next in line to be the king of Saudi Arabia is basically his hands are all over this. His fingerprints are all over it. So we'll see where that goes. They came out Friday after a whole week of denying they did anything about it, to saying that he was killed in the embassy and that they, in fact, knew about it. The Turks admitted to having audio and video of the embassy, of the consulate, which means they bugged it, right? That's kind of a violation of international norms there. So there's a lot on that story, and I'm sure that'll develop, and we'll talk about that maybe next week if something else doesn't come up. But I think that's all I want to say for today. Have a great week. I know we've got Halloween coming up, so I do want to see that movie. It just came out. I'm a fan of horror movies generally. I would say that I don't like the blood and guts and the gore, but I do appreciate the suspense and the weird world that they have, where it's like, people can do this, and you've got people who act like complete morons. It's kind of amusing. It's not high art, but it's good for a laugh or for being afraid, like riding a roller coaster. Anyway, that's a tangent. Have a good week. I'll see you next time, and take care. Bye.